So we're going to do a few quick demos to kind of drive home some of the points that we talked about in our discussions, our PowerPoint-led discussions the other day. All right, so the first one I'm looking at here now, notice I'm using the Northwind database, one of the oldest sample databases in common circulation for many, many, many years, right? So that's just a particular one that I had here handy, right? So we're going to use that particular database for this first example. And I'm going to cheat, right? I'm going to use that create or alter approach here. I'm going to make a stored procedure, right? And with create or alter, I can create it if it's not there. If it is there, then I just alter it instead by giving a new definition of it, right? Okay, now let me talk about this for a second before I go on. Notice my prefix is USP. Now I mentioned the other day that SP underscore, that is industry standard. That is the prefix used for all of the built-in supplied stored procedures that are already there in the system, right? So adding the letter U in front, okay, is a short form for user stored procedure as opposed to the built-in stored procedures, right? So, I mentioned that I'm not, totally 100% firm, on, follow this exact naming convention. As long as you're consistent, that's the most important thing. But this one you're going to find is pretty much universally used, right? The USP indicates it's a user stored procedure as opposed to one of the built-in ones. Anyway, enough about that. So the idea is it's going to be list orders by date. So there's an orders table. And something else we talked about is the idea that we want to be able to, instead of creating 3 perhaps separate stored procedures, right? Maybe if you want one that you want all orders after a given date, you can make one stored procedure for that. You can make another separate stored procedure for all the orders before a given date, right? And then a third version for, everything between 2 dates, right? Well, we want to get away from having, all those separate objects and find a way to make this one stored procedure handle all 3 of those different situations or scenarios, right? So we're going to need some parameters then, and here's our trick to it, right? We're going to set for our 2 parameters, our start and end date, default values. That way, if we don't supply a value for a starting date, and perhaps just for an ending date, right, then in that case, no problem. It will use the default value. So what are we using here for the values themselves? We talked about this as well. Based on the data type, okay, of our parameters. So the date data type, the oldest date it supports is January 1st of the year 1, right? And the maximum date it supports is December 31st of the year 9999, okay? So by using those as the default values, okay, then we can optionally provide a beginning and ending date, or just an ending date, or just a start date, and then it will use, if we're only supplying one or the other, it will use the appropriate values. If we don't supply any, then it will use basically the entire range of dates that the data type allows, which logically should give us all of the data in the table. So that way the stored procedure handles all 3 of those situations, right? Now, just before I go on though, an important point I might not have emphasized enough is if we supply a value, then the default is not used. And that is true, even if the value we supply is null. The keyword null, right? So if I supply null, it's going to want to use null instead of the default value. So that's one reason why you're going to see me do something you might think at first isn't necessary. We talked about this. With any parameters, best practice calls for us to test the parameters as early as possible, right? Rather than doing additional code first. So here I'm going to check if I actually have null for the start or end date, right? Then that means I actually pass null. And if you test it out in the query, it means that it will not return values, right? If you actually try to use null for the beginning and ending date, right? So that's an error. So we're going to raise an error. Dates cannot be null, and we just return, right? We don't return a value. We just end the procedure execution at that point, and that's that, okay? So that's our best practice. Check the parameter values and then carry on. So the next thing, of course, was do the actual select. So we know we have values that aren't null, either provided by values passed to the parameters or our defaults that we've set up. So we're going to select everything from the orders table, basically between our starting and ending date. Okay, So let's go ahead and run this code and execute that. There we go. So now we have that stored procedure in place, right? Okay, so next we're going to actually use it. So I just added in this basic query, select star from orders. Okay, we'll just execute that. And we see that we have down here 830 rows of data, right? Lots and lots of data. So let's play around with this a little bit. So I'm going to execute my stored procedure, giving a start date and an end date. Notice I'm passing by position, providing values for both, okay? So if I execute that, then I've filtered. Notice I only have 55 rows of data, down from 830, I think it was, right? And all the dates are inside this date range for all the data that I have. Okay, it worked. All right. Now we can also pass parameters by position, okay? And this gives us even more flexibility. Sorry, by name. That was by position. Now I'm going to do it by name. So if I do this whole command here to execute, passing values for the end date and start date, notice I can do it in any order because I'm doing it by name, right? In this case, I have 58 rows of data, okay? Notice that the dates are different, right? Between these two dates that I've specified. But notice this. I could just provide an end date, right? So it will use the minimum date value for my start date. I have 154 rows this time. So that shows you the flexibility. It's harder with passing by position, but when I can pass by name, I could easily do this, right? Now, if I wanted to just pass a start date, okay, then I have to make sure, if I put null here, you might think, well, this should work. And try to execute this line of code. Let's notice what happens. Okay, there's my dates cannot be null. So I can't, okay, now if I just left out the end date, right, just pass a value for the start date by name, then that works. Okay, I have 734 rows that are after this particular date. All right. And of course, that was just to show you again, if I pass null for anything, then I'm just going to get my error, right? Final demonstration here, if I don't have any parameter values passed, it's going to do what? It's going to return them all 830 rows of data, because it's using those minimum and maximum values as my range, right, for between this date and that date. Okay. All right, so we've seen how, that's one way to set up this type of a stored procedure that's reusable. Okay, there's some limitations to it, right? Tricky to provide a, now if I did this, right, even though I'm passing by position, right, because that's the first one in position, I should get away with this. Let me try it. Yep, 270 rows of data. There are 270 orders after, okay, 1998-0101, right? And that's fine. But, if I wanted to use by position and the ending date, right, as opposed to the start date, that would be very, very difficult to do, right? Because I'd have to try to put a null here as a placeholder, and the null, of course, is not allowed, right? Okay. All right, so there's some limitations, but in general, it makes it very, very easy to reuse the one stored procedure for multiple purposes. So that's our first quick little demo.